So we'll get going here in the next few seconds. Okay, my name is Bob Van Brocklin. I'm chairman of the Oregon Transportation Commission, and I hereby call the May 14th, 2020 meeting of the Oregon Transportation Commission to order. I want to welcome all of you who are attending this morning. I also want to thank all of you who have submitted written comments to us. Your comments are important to us, and we appreciate your sharing your viewpoints, and we'll consider them carefully as we move forward on our strategic planning process. And with respect to non-strategic planning communications on matters that you've raised with us or have commented on that we're involved in. So I'm going to just confirm that a few people are on the phone who are going to be making presentations this morning, and to make sure all of the members of the commission are on. So Vice Chair Simpson. Vice Chair on? Or muted and here? Okay, I'll come back to him. Commissioner Callery? On. Commissioner Brown?
Here.
Commissioner Smith? Morning, Sharon. Director Strickler?
I am on, sir.
Super Brown?
I'm here, Mr. Chair.
Nikotros Perkins?
Nikotros is on.
Nikotros? And Travis Brower.
Here.
Okay. Just a few opening comments. As you know, today we are beginning a strategic planning process that we expect will take several months to complete. Our goal in this process is to identify a short set of priorities and goals, and then develop a detailed implementation plan to achieve those priorities and goals. So the priorities, the goals, and the implementation plan together will make up the elements of our strategic plan. We purposely identified a relatively short planning horizon for this initial plan. Only on 2022 as we expect to review the plan beginning in 2023, and that plan may be a little longer, running 3 to 4 years. To begin the process and promote an open discussion rather than by language, we have developed a short list of priorities and goals to provoke discussion and allow us to think through this with the commission with the help of the department. So we're not focused on final language or even first rewrite language. We're trying to settle on a short number of priorities and goals and then begin to build out the plan from there. We're beginning the process today, which is effectively day one of the effort. Unlike some prior strategic planning efforts by the OTC, we are trying to do this in as collaborative a manner as possible with the department, who will have significant responsibility for its implementation. Today, we are going to hear a number of presentations from ODOT personnel that will help the Commission provide and the Department develop a common basis for developing the plan, and we may have additional presentations throughout the process. At the end of today's session, we will have an initial discussion about priorities and goals as our last segment, and we may make a few initial decisions, but we plan to have, as I say, a final document to discuss, not have a final document to discuss and approve until August. I want to thank the director, the assistant directors, and others who have been involved in initial discussions about the process that has led up to today's session. As always, we invite public comment as we develop the plan. We appreciate input and will certainly consider comments that are provided. Our goal is to approve a plan that focuses on among the highest priorities of the Commission and sets a strategic direction, and a plan that we can implement and do implement in a timely manner. So unless there are questions from the Commission, I think I will turn it over to Director Strickler for his director's report. Questions of me? Okay. Director Strickler.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good morning, Chairman Rockland, members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Chris Strickler, Director of ODOT. My remarks will be brief this morning, part to try and get us a little bit of schedule time, but also I want to make sure that we have time to get to the meat of the conversation, which is really the Commission having a dialogue around the priorities that the Chair just described. As we look to the meat of today's meeting, as well as future discussions for workshops for the Commission, as well as work planning efforts that feed into that strategic plan that the Chair mentioned, my note to the Commission is simply this. This is our starting point. We really appreciate the collaboration and agree with the approach of really a combined strategic plan that is simple, implementable, and something that creates tangible results. We have expectations upon us, not just of the agency, but also the Commission and the agency combined. And we think aligning a strategic plan that really helps to look forward at the transportation goals that we're trying to achieve. And it's really important that we start that effort really with a conversation around priorities and what we plan to do as we go forward, especially as we start to look at strains on budgets and other things that we will go through today. A good portion of today will be background and context setting, some of the information that we think is really important for the Commission to understand as the Commission deliberates on ongoing priorities and goals. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll probably comfortable.
Great. So we do have as item C on the agenda just a quick more comment than a discussion. And Chris, feel free to weigh in. And as we're going through the day, let me mention that we need to be conscious that people are listening to us rather than seeing us, and therefore we need to continue to identify ourselves as we go through the day. So again, this is Bob Van Brocklin, Chair of the Commission. This segment is Chris, one you and I are sharing, but I just make a brief comment on the on communications and policy development. As we with respect to policy initiatives, as we go through the planning work, we may identify the need to develop proposals to other governmental entities, whether it be the legislature or the executive, the governor's office, or partnering governments in order to implement our plan. So I just mentioned that because that's something we ought to be bearing in mind. We're not doing this in isolation. We're doing this and need to be doing the planning and the implementation in a manner that is connecting with other the partners of ours, both in government and beyond government, in order to be making good decisions and making sure we can implement. But the policy initiatives in particular may require the involvement of other governmental entities and particularly the legislature and the governor. So I just want to put a placeholder on that. It's not called out in the document that we're going to be looking at today, which is a discussion document, fairly succinct. But it is sitting there clearly as something we need to be thinking about, because there are pieces of the implementation of this that will require intergovernmental cooperation and others that will require intrastate agencies or legislative or executive involvement and leadership. The other thing is with respect to communications, and there the Commission, and this is something that I think is a continuing interest of the Commission, which will be confirmed in the course of the day. But I think it's fair to say the Commission desires an active communication strategy around our strategic plan and other actions and involvements that other things we're involved in. And that active communication strategy involves trying to ensure that as we're taking actions and as we're completing elements of the plan, that we're ensuring that we're communicating about them so that people know what we're doing. And that is maybe a little bit different than communication style we've had on occasion in the past. And so we just need to be more conscious of communicating effectively with our partners, stakeholders, the public, and others, clearly the legislature and the governor, to ensure that what we're doing is that it's clear what we're doing and why we're doing it. So with that, Chris, if you've got additional comments, Director Strickler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, from me, is really more of a summary of what I believe we are hearing and some confirmation from myself and the agency that we are hearing. As we start to talk about priorities going forward in a combined strategic plan between the OTC and ODOT, it's really imperative that we identify those areas where we have to create policy or create initiatives or support those initiatives that come forward, and then communicate those as you just described. I've heard clearly that we are in search of an active communications effort and communications plan to really be proactive in the things that we are working on, the things that we are doing, but also dynamic enough to respond to the needs of our customers. And that's been a clear message from the Commission, I believe, as well as some of our efforts that we've been working on, which is recognizing that customer base is the traveling public, providing choice, providing access, recognizing our role in reduction of greenhouse gases, and what we can do as far as implementing actions as we move forward with our strategic planning efforts. So, Mr. Chair, I guess my message is thank you for that guidance. Members of the Commission, thank you for that guidance. We hear you and want to continue to work on that active communication effort as we go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Director. And unless there are comments from the Commission, we'll move on to item D. Questions or comments? Okay. Mr. Brown, delegations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, everyone else out there. This item is item number D. It's the delegation recommendations. There was an attachment in your packet. I'm hoping that you all have that in front of you. If you're able to pull that up, I think that'd be most helpful as we walk through this. The attachment before you is really following up on what we heard from you at your last OTC meeting in April, specifically on the desire that we heard you all voice to spend your time and energy setting the department's vision and strategy as opposed to spending your limited time really bogged down in some of the operational details that the department is capable of handling. So as you'll recall, in April, you made a decision to up the STIP thresholds, and it was really with this idea in mind. These are similar ideas and recommendations that we have as a department that we think fit in that category. I guess I'd say we recognize that you might want to have more discussion around some of these items. And as discussed at the last OTC meeting, we do recommend that the delegations in general and these kind of procedures be revisited on a regular basis throughout the year. And it sounded like you all agreed with that. We heard from you in April that you want to at least revisit this topic after your July workshop to ensure roles and responsibilities are aligned after deciding on the combined strategic plan that was just mentioned. And so that would be a great time for us to bring back any of these items that you want further discussion on if we don't get there today. So I just flagged that for your awareness. I guess I'd also flag for you that we envision bringing back in July or August after you've had your workshop another set of procedural recommendations really around ODOT programs and what specifically comes before you as a commission as opposed to what you're comfortable allowing us to manage, but really be more ODOT program focused to make sure we're looking consistently across the programs because to date it's been somewhat different depending on the program as to what gets brought before you. But for today, the 11 items before you are the ones we think really warrant a revisiting. I'll give you a couple more caveats before we dive into the items. First and foremost, I think it goes without saying, and this was a topic last time we had this conversation in April, obviously anything at any time can be elevated up to the OTC and the director and other leaders within the department. Certainly we'll keep that in mind, and obviously you all can raise anything up that you want to see and have a fuller conversation about, regardless of authority or current procedure, if so desired. Some of these items, 3 out of the 11, I believe, actually don't change authorities, and they're really just they're updating our procedures that were based on past preferences of either individual commissioners or just the way that former ODOT leadership like to do things. I would tell you we've used a lens of risk management to arrive at this list. We've been very mindful of not wanting to be taking everything to the OTC for action. We see that as kind of a risk avoidance approach, and it's not where we want to be. We vetted all these recommendations with our DOJ colleagues, and they don't see any legal issues with them. So with those caveats, I'll turn to the actual matrix before you, which again has 11 items on it, and speak briefly to those. If you'll notice items 1 through 4, those are really about plans. They're about big statewide transportation policy plans like the OTP, all the way down to modal plans like public transportation, to more locally focused plans like interchange area management plans, the IAMPs, all of which require formal action to adopt or approve. All these plans also at times need to be amended. There's also generally a public involvement component with all of these plans. In the past, we've relied heavily on the OTC meetings to serve as those public opportunities for comment. What we're requesting here in general is to delegate those things to the agency to manage and take action on. So we'd still have a public process. We'd still take in feedback and input and ensure that there's transparent decision making, just without using the OTC meeting time for all those items. Now, some things, of course, will be significant changes to existing plans or policies, and those would still be brought before you as the commission for your dialogue or decision making as needed. So I guess the minor plan amendments really, to my mind, that might be the question that you're wrestling with, is what are those minor plan amendments? Really what we're talking about here are the technical adjustments or corrections that carry out the administrative, operational, or management functions of the highway system. So typically these would be changes that don't have significant policy implications. They're minor classification impacts. They're local state system impacts with really not much of an impact on the overall state system. So that's items 1 through 4 in a nutshell. Turning to 5, 6, and 7, I'd characterize these really as being about the transportation system and how it's managed. Historically, a lot of these items have come before you, but hasn't gotten a lot of discussion by you all at the commission. So these are either steps the agency needs to take to manage the system, like designating a new highway when it's built, for instance, Highway 62 Expressway in Southern Oregon or the Newburgh-Dundee Bypass in the Willamette Valley, or they're more administrative in nature. For example, agreement with the city on how they'll manage the highway system through their downtown within a statewide transportation area, or entering into a jurisdictional transfer with the city or county as they take over a section of a highway. So that's the type of things we're talking about here that would be delegated down to the director. Items 8, 9, 10 all have to do with grants. 8 is about distributing federal funds to MPOs on a yearly basis, something that we feel we can handle without OTC engagement. What we're not talking about here is the formula for distributing those funds. That would, of course, still reside squarely with the commission, and that'd be something we talk about with you all if changes are needed on that at any time. Number 9 is about those funding programs that distribute funds outside of the big selection cycles, what we typically call the discretionary grants. We would still bring those big selection cycles decisions themselves to you all, but really the in-between stuff would be what we're talking about here. And we would take advantage of being able to make decisions about funding immediate needs without having to come to the commission for approval. So a good example would be the Safe Routes to School program, where the big selection cycle every few years would still come before the commission, but the smaller grants distributed through the discretionary program or portion of the program that fall in between, those would be handled and approved at the agency level. One thing of note is this is not intended to include the stiff discretionary program grant awards. Turning to 10, pretty straightforward. We certainly don't want to get bogged down or slowed down in applying for federal funds as long as it's a straightforward process. And so we'd ask that you kind of give us the approval to do that. Number 11 is about right-of-way acquisitions. As you are all well familiar with, every month we bring you a right-of-way resolution to acquire property, mainly for improvements along our state highways. That authority allows us to use all the tools available to us, up to and including condemnation, to acquire property when needed. Now, we try hard to only use condemnation as a last resort. Sometimes it's needed, though, because we can't find the owners of the property, because it's maybe owned by generations of an extended family, sometimes because someone died during the negotiation process. And so in some rare cases, we use the right of eminent domain to condemn and take control of the property to begin construction. So what we're recommending here is delegating your authority to approve these property acquisitions to the director. Now, he, of course, or she, would, of course, be escalating things up to the commission when they think it's warranted. And so I could well envision some of those condemnations fitting that category. I guess I'd flag also here that we want to purposely change our approach to how we handle right-of-way acquisitions. The way we handle it was identified in the 2019 audit on right-of-way processes for the department. And this change that we're proposing supports the other efforts we're taking to improve our project delivery process and performance really across the board. I think it sets the right kind of incentive structure and forces us to focus our attention on getting those key elements right instead of perhaps relying on the commission for those decisions. So with that quick run through, and I know it's brief, and apologies for that, that's really what I wanted to share with you. I guess as mentioned, I would remind you, we can bring back any of these if you would like for additional conversation in July or beyond. But in the meantime, I'm happy to answer questions you have on this process, on any of these items. I'll also flag for you that we do have some folks who are more subject matter experts in each of these individual items on the line who are probably able to answer some more weedy questions if you have them. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Chair and Commissioners, for any questions.
Thank you, Assistant Director Brown. This is the only item on the agenda that's an action item. For today's meeting. Questions of Cooper?
If necessary, sorry, this is Orlando. If necessary, could these delegations be amended at any time, or is this decision that we're making today, is this a permanent? I mean, how often are we going to be looking into these delegation authorities in the future?
Sure, that's a great question, Vice Chair Simpson. So the short answer is these can be amended and changed at any time if you so desire. And the thinking really, as we discussed a little bit last month, is we think it'd be prudent to have more regular kind of revisiting of some of these ways that we do business, because things are fluid with both kind of your desires, the membership of the commission, even with some leadership within the department, and so much of this hinges upon all of those factors that we think revisiting it regularly throughout the year would be warranted. But if anything doesn't work with this approach, then we can change it back at any time.
Great, thanks.
Other questions?
This is Commissioner Calorie. I have a question about how we would handle, let's envision that there is a significant federal funding program that comes out of the pandemic situation, and it's kind of open-ended. We have, there's no specific thing that comes down with the funding. How would we handle the delegation or the direction that we would provide staff on that?
So in that case, I'll give you my thoughts, and then I'll maybe turn it over to see if others have contradictory thoughts. In that case, when we're talking about something so big and substantive as a big funding package, I would think we would still be bringing that to you to have you all as part of that conversation, because that's a new element kind of into the fiscal equation that we have, and that it really would be part of a conversation that warrants commission input. So I think that would clearly not be something that we would just be deciding on in a vacuum, but be leveraging your input on. I don't know if that answers your question, and I guess I'd maybe open it up if anybody else has from ODOT has anything else to add on that.
Maybe the director could comment, because I do think the scheme, Commissioner Calorie, relies upon the director making judgments. But I agree with Assistant Director Brown's comment. I think anything like that would be something we'd be talking about at the commission and would be involved in making decisions about. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Calorie, I think the way that I would address that would be, I think, twofold. One is clearly on something that's a major infusion of funding, depending upon what program it applies to, et cetera. We really do need that commission conversation and guidance to help inform funding splits and things like that, especially if it's not already prescribed by our federal partners. I think the only caveat and the second point that I would make to that is if we have some sense of urgency in, say, a significant funding source that comes in that is really intended to be pass-through funding, I might suggest kind of briefings that occur, but not waiting for the next commission meeting to get those funding elements flowing to our local partners. So that kind of dialogue. So certainly nothing moving without a conversation with the chair and with the commission, but potentially having the authority to be able to move those things so that we don't get into a timing conversation as it relates to commission meetings. Now, the other piece, frankly, is we could always call a special commission meeting at the discretion of the commission. and certainly keep those elements entirely within the commission purview. None of these efforts are intended to be something that says the agency should take control. Actually, a little bit more the opposite, to allow some of the bandwidth at the commission meetings themselves to really take some of the things that might be more day-to-day operational and put them in the agency so that the commission can work on those guidance and vision and forward-looking efforts.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question, and I appreciate your overview.
Other questions? Okay. I would be looking for a motion then on this.
I move to approve the proposed delegations to the ODOT management team.
Is there a second?
This is Orlando.
Commissioner Smith, seconds.
Commissioner Smith seconds the motion. Further discussion? Okay, if not, I'm going to take a roll call vote unless there's further questions or comments. Okay, so we'll vote now. Vice Chair Simpson.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Callery.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
And the chair votes aye. The proposal is approved. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Assistant Director Brown, for your presentation. Appreciate it. And we will now move on to an informational item, item E. Mr. Strickler, Mr. Brower, and Ms. Perkins will lead that discussion. I hope I'm not leaving someone out here. Oh, I guess Ms. Baker and Mr. Brown as well. So it's the director and the assistant directors.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the commission, we wanted to give kind of a high-level overview of the impacts that we're experiencing so far. I think I would stress many of the impacts are still being experienced on a day-to-day basis, and changes occur as you think about just what's open, what is not open, the availability of resources, et cetera, for the overall agency. We also, as you well know, have different functions within the agency. So customer service facing functions that are direct day-to-day customer service interaction with our DMV group, for example, and then our construction services that are quite different in how we operate clearly, and none of that is new to the commission. Our hope for this agenda topic is to really give an overview and answer any questions about the current status that we're in, and maybe give a little bit of background. So our hope is to hit the impact and implications potentially on the funding that the agency has to use, but then also on our day-to-day operations and maybe what the impact is for some of our partner agencies across the state. So as we walk through this, please feel free to dive in with any questions. And I think what I'll try to do is, rather than jump around within the assistant directors and myself, I think what I'll do is I'll give an introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Mr. Brower to talk about funding implications and DMV, and then he will then hand it on down to Mr. Brown, and then down to Ms. Baker, and then from Ms. Baker to Ms. Perkins, so that you have a single person to kind of help with the flow of the conversation right now. We'll take a brief pause in between each to be able to address any questions if that works for you. I know some of the questions that we have right now that will be answered. What is the impact on funding? What is the possibility we see coming as a potential federal relief or economic stimulus package? And how do we continue to ensure public participation in this interesting time? And I use the word interesting because, quite frankly, it's a devastating time for a lot of people, and how we operate has really impacted not just the things that the agency does, but the individuals of the agency and state enterprise across the board. From an overall standpoint, most of you are probably already aware that 10 o'clock this morning, the governor is likely to announce some sense of reopening. And reopening is a phase reopening. And rather than me butcher what the different phase criteria are, I would say that a three-phase opening strategy or criteria will be evaluated by the Oregon Health Authority and the governor's office on a county-by-county basis. So as we think about the counties across the state of Oregon, we have to adapt to what that looks like for our overall customer service aspect. A few items of note, when we started early March, before the pandemic was really upon us, we had roughly 200 to 300 people on telework status within the agency. So as a reminder, the agency is about 4,700 people. So that gives you an idea of what our maturity around telework was at that time. Our IT department, our staff, and across the agency and the team of ODOT really stepped into what it means to kind of shift to a different way of doing business. And we've been using the term what a new normal looks like, because going back to kind of previous business operations is probably not likely in our near term or even long-term future. But those 200 to 300 telework efforts or individuals quickly grew to something of almost 2,000 within about a week. So about a week to a week and a half, we had to stand up the ability to not just the network capacity, but individual access, and et cetera. And again, I'm not an IT expert, so I won't say what it took, but I can tell you it's a Herculean lift. And so they've done a great job in responding to that. When you think about that number transitioning to telework, we then also have to think about how do we continue to staff and continue the work efforts for our construction program, for example. And so our construction program, by comparison to other states, we are one of the few that has continued our construction efforts. And I think that that is significant to the economy, and it's also significant to keeping talent within the state of Oregon, which is really important for talent and availability for ongoing work. And so it's been one of those things that our group, as well as private enterprise, so the individual contractors and the individual consultant groups that have been working within our industry, they have really stepped up to really make it possible to continue the work efforts as opposed to pausing all of those efforts. Clearly, we have seen a reduction in traffic. At one point, within the last several weeks, we saw almost a 40% reduction in overall traffic on the system. And in some ways, that is an absolute benefit to the overall environmental goals that we are trying to achieve as an agency. A significant reduction in greenhouse gas, for example. And we know that transportation contributes to 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. But the disbenefit there is, of course, the impact of the economy, and we have to be mindful of that, and we have to balance those efforts as an agency. And so we have interesting and difficult, complex times in front of us as we start to think about the impact of the economy and the impact to the overall budget of the agency and what we are and are not able to accomplish with the funding that might be available to us. So with that kind of overview and background, I think now would be the appropriate time to turn it over to Mr. Brower to start talking about funding implications and operations for DMV and commerce and compliance. But before I do, I would pause for one last statement, which is with some counties entering into phase one status, or at least we're anticipating that that is likely as part of the announcement coming from the governor at 10 a.m. this morning. We are actively working on plans to look at reopening efforts specific to DMV. We have a significant demand and a significant push from our customer base that is really eager to get back in and conduct their transactions. And so we'll be working with the DMV to see what options we have available to us and what the potential demand is paired with those options. And with that, I'll pause for any questions before turning it over to Mr. Brower. Okay, Mr. Brower, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Mr. Director. I'll talk a bit about the revenue and project impacts that we're seeing around the state, and then talk about the DMV and Commerce Compliance Division operations issues. Chris gave you background on the traffic reductions that we have seen. Our economists released their semi-annual revenue forecast in early April. It was developed really early in the public health emergency before sufficient data was really available to make a firm forecast of the pandemic's impact on revenue. It was particularly difficult to forecast the duration of the economic closures caused by COVID-19. So they did their best, but they're going to update the revenue forecast in July once more economic data is available and we have a better sense of the duration and severity of the pandemic. But as you can imagine, with traffic volumes initially down about 40% across the state, the forecast shows fuels tax revenue falling significantly for several months. However, we are seeing a little bit